It was a cold morning in 1924, and the world seemed unaware of the impending tragedy. Two climbers, George Mallory and Andrew Irvine, set off on an expedition to Mount Everest, challenging a mountain that many believed was unbeatable. Their story wasn't just about climbing a mountain, it was about a promise to return. Mallory, already experienced on the slopes of the mighty mountain, and Irvine, with his youthful and daring spirit, had a clear goal: to reach the top of the world. But contrary to what the world expected, what came next wasn't the heroic return of two victorious men, but the absolute silence of a tragedy. They never came back. As Everest swallowed their tracks, the void they left behind echoed louder than the pain of loss. Wives, families, and friends, all wondering with no answers what had happened. The pain of not knowing, the anguish of imagining that there might be no explanation, filled the nights of those who remained. Mallory's wife, Ruth, spent sleepless nights seeking solace in thoughts that came and went, between the hope that he was merely lost and the sadness that perhaps he had failed on the mountain, never even reaching the summit. How would she cope with the idea that the promise made would never be kept? The emptiness was a constant shadow, heavier than Everest's eternal snow. Decades passed, and the mystery was never solved. Rumors grew, theories multiplied, but nothing proved anything. The questions hung in the air, like an echo, and the suffering of the families never ceased. The world never knew whether Mallory and Irvine succeeded in reaching the summit, if death came before their victory, or if, somehow, the mountain defeated them before they could achieve the impossible. What happened on that final walk, at dizzying altitudes and under Everest's fierce winds, was never fully understood. But what's worse than having no answers? Doubt. The doubt that eats away at the hearts of those who loved and waited. Everest, with its relentless silence, remained the last to know the truth, and the first to keep its secrets. In 1924, the disappearance of George Mallory and Andrew Irvine wasn't just an epic event in the world of mountaineering. For the climbers' families, it marked the beginning of a journey filled with pain, doubt, and uncertainty that would last for decades. Mallory's wife, Ruth, saw her world crumble with the news of her husband's disappearance. It was a time when communication wasn't instant, and each piece of news took time to arrive. When she learned that her husband had set off for Everest in search of glory, Ruth never imagined he wouldn't come back. What should have been the realization of a dream turned into a constant and silent nightmare. Ruth, like any deeply loving wife, found herself submerged in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The pain of not knowing what had happened to her husband became a constant shadow every day. She clung to the hope that he was simply lost somewhere on the mountain, unable to find his way back. She thought of all the possibilities. Maybe he was on the brink of the summit, trying to achieve that immeasurable feat, when the mountain, with its indomitable force, brought him down. Ruth, more than anyone else, wanted to believe that her husband hadn't failed, that he had made it to the top, and, for some tragic reason, couldn't return. But the lack of answers made the pain even more unbearable, turning doubt into an emotional weight that was hard to bear. The weeks, months, and years that followed the disappearance of Mallory and Irvine didn't bring the relief that was hoped for. The emptiness left Ruth even further removed from reality, as speculation about the cause of the disappearance replaced any concrete answers. The most accepted theory at first was that both had died in an accident, victims of Everest's treacherous weather. Some said the altitude had suffocated them, that the thin air had knocked them unconscious, or that a miscalculation had led to their deaths. Others suggested that psychological suffering could have been the culprit, speculating that both, desperate and exhausted, made poor decisions in the final hours of their journey. The The theory of accidental death seemed to make sense to many, but for Ruth, no explanation was enough to fill the void of uncertainty. She knew the truth was more complicated, but what could she do when no one really knew what had happened to the man she loved? Over the years, Ruth began to feel like she was living in an emotional limbo. There were times when she clung to any shred of hope, like a lifeline. She imagined that somehow Mallory might have left behind a secret message or a sign, something that could indicate that he had indeed reached the top, as he had dreamed. But those moments of hope were quickly followed by the anguish of knowing he would never return to tell his story. There were no bodies, no clear signs of where the climbers might be. All that remained were speculations and rumors. The pain of losing someone without a concrete answer became a form of constant psychological torture. As Ruth sank deeper into this sea of uncertainty, Mallory's daughter, who was very young when he left, grew up without her father. For her, the lack of answers meant more than just the pain of not knowing what happened to him. It was the loss of an image, of a memory that could never be built. She had no vivid recollections of her father, only stories distorted by time and uncertainty. How could she grow up with this constant absence, with the idea that perhaps her father had never truly achieved what everyone thought was impossible? This doubt echoed in her mind with each new step in her life, a doubt that would become part of her identity. She couldn't even remember his face, how he would have called her, or the words he might have said. As deep as Mallory's daughter's pain was, she wasn't alone in her suffering. Irvine, though he had set out with Mallory in search of a great accomplishment, also left behind a family marked by uncertainty. His mother and siblings lived with the hope of a return that never came. The sense of loss, with no clear answers, spread throughout his family. Life moved on, but Irvine's absence made celebrations, birthdays, and happy moments feel more bitter, as if he had never left a tangible mark. The women and children left behind had to deal with an existence without the physical presence of their loved ones, but also without the certainty needed to overcome the pain. The weight of this absence dragged on through the years. With every new winter, Everest seemed to challenge the families of the climbers even more. The world kept moving forward, with new expeditions and new success stories. But for Ruth and Mallory's children, Everest always reminded them of a story that had been interrupted. The pain of losing someone who had been, for so long, a hero in their own journey, grew deeper. The years passed, but the pain of not knowing what really happened to Mallory and Irvine never disappeared. Time, instead of healing, only deepened the suffering and frustration. The lack of answers made everything more unbearable. The emotional impact on Mallory and Irvine's families, combined with the weight of unfulfilled expectations, meant the years that followed were a constant process of mourning and uncertainty. Until finally, something changed. In 1979, a clue was discovered on Everest, almost 75 years after the disappearance of the two climbers. The renewed hope brought a new wave of emotion and expectation, but it also reignited the old questions. What really happened on that fateful ascent? Did Mallory and Irvine truly reach the summit, as many believed? Or had Everest, in fact, defeated them before they could achieve glory? The clue found reignited the flames of doubt and hope, but also brought back all the suffering of the families. The pain of knowing that perhaps the truth was finally within reach, but the answers might still be more complex and painful than anyone could have imagined. Mallory and Irvine were lost, but the search for answers would continue to haunt those who loved these two enigmatic figures. The mystery of Everest was still far from being solved, and the emotional weight that the families had carried for decades would become even harder to bear with the new discoveries that were yet to come. The year 1979 brought a shocking twist to the mystery of George Mallory and Andrew Irvine's disappearance. Over 50 years after the 1924 expedition, Everest, with its silent vastness, seemed to finally offer a clue. Up until then, the story of these two climbers had been marked by speculation and theories, but no concrete evidence had emerged to explain what really happened on that fateful journey. Many believed that Everest had simply defeated them, swallowing them whole without leaving a trace. During one of their explorations in the more remote areas of the mountain, one of the climbers found what appeared to be an abandoned backpack, with no signs of life around. At first glance, the object seemed like nothing more than an oddity. However, when the backpack was carefully opened, something much more mysterious emerged. Inside it, the investigators found a small object that quickly stood out: a camera, which seemed to be the key to a series of answers the world had been waiting for so long. The object found wasn't just any backpack. It carried with it the promise of a conclusion that had, until then, seemed unthinkable. The camera, with its film intact, could have been one of the last pieces of the puzzle. But what really surprised everyone was the fact that the camera undoubtedly belonged to one of the missing climbers, George Mallory. The film, which had been carefully preserved inside the backpack, contained images that could finally confirm what many had been wondering. Did Mallory and Irvine really reach the top of Everest before succumbing to the mountain's cruel fate? What the investigators and historians couldn't predict, however, was the mixed reaction and new wave of speculation that this discovery would generate. For climbing experts and those who had studied the 1924 expedition, the discovery of the camera was both a confirmation and a question. If Mallory and Irvine had indeed reached the top, what had happened to them afterward? The idea that they might have died after conquering Everest seemed absurd at first to many. After all, if they had reached the summit, how could they have disappeared so quickly without leaving any trace? This initial revelation was a blow to many who had believed the simplest explanation was the true one, that the climbers had failed, like so many before them, succumbing to the extreme difficulty of the mountain. Theories of miscalculations, disorientation, or even early death due to lack of oxygen began to be questioned. Now, the possibility that Mallory and Irvine had indeed reached the top of Everest and still lost their lives under mysterious circumstances seemed like a more plausible explanation. However, the experts weren't willing to accept the evidence from the camera without further investigation. The film found in the camera was carefully developed, and the images that emerged surprised everyone even more. Although the images weren't clear enough to definitively confirm that the summit had been reached, there was one particularly intriguing photo that suggested they had gotten much closer to the top than any previous expedition. The photo showed Mallory and Irvine, both visibly tired and exhausted, but with a landscape that seemed to match what the view would be like from an altitude near the summit. These images renewed the mystery. Mallory and Irvine, it seemed, had achieved something historic. But then why had they disappeared? The big question following the discovery of the camera wasn't just about reaching the summit, but what had happened right after those images were taken. Investigators began to wonder if, even having reached the top, they might have faced a tragic and unpredictable fate shortly afterward. Could they have been victims of hunger, extreme exhaustion, or a storm that caught them unprepared? Or perhaps something even more disturbing had occurred, something no one was willing to consider. For years, the myth of Mallory and Irvine had been shaped by stories and rumors, but now a new line of investigation had opened. The possibility that the climbers had reached the summit not only challenged the initial explanations, but also raised new questions. If Mallory and Irvine really succeeded, how could they have disappeared without leaving clear clues? How could two experienced mountaineers have achieved something so great and yet failed so tragically? The twist caused by the discovery of the camera not only brought a new theory to light, but also brought more questions. And with that, the mystery was intensified. like a flame that never fully goes out. With the new tangible clue, investigators began to review the old expeditions that followed Mallory and Irvine's, trying to discover more about what really happened. Some of these expeditions had reports indicating that Mallory and Irvine's presence might have been confirmed much later than previously thought, with other climbers reporting seeing their tracks in areas of Everest where no one had thought to look for them. Perhaps Everest had indeed kept their footprints longer than experts had imagined. Meanwhile, the families of Mallory and Irvine, especially Ruth, George Mallory's wife, began to feel a mix of renewed hope and anguish. What did this discovery mean for them? After so many decades of waiting, would it finally be possible to understand what really happened to their loved ones? The clue found on Everest reignited the possibility of a truth finally being revealed, but it also brought back the pain of so many decades without answers. Ruth, who had always believed in the possibility that her husband had made history, now found herself facing a new truth that could be even more complex and painful than she had ever imagined. The discovery not only brought a new perspective on the mystery of Mallory and Irvine, but also rekindled the flame of hope for many who still believed that the truth was, somehow, within reach. Everest, which for so long had been the tomb of so many dreams, now seemed willing to reveal the truth to the world. But, as always, Mount Everest showed itself to be an unpredictable entity, the keeper of its secrets. What would happen in the following years was still to come, but one thing was certain: the mystery of Mallory and Irvine was far from solved, and the search for answers would continue to challenge those willing to face the mountain's limits. The mystery of George Mallory and Andrew Irvine's disappearance, passed down from generation to generation, finally took a new perspective in 1979 when a surprising discovery was made on Everest. It was as if the mountain, silent and imposing, was finally ready to give up a clue about what happened on that fateful 1924 expedition. The world, which had spent over half a century trying to understand the fate of the two missing climbers, saw its long wait broken by the revelation of a crucial trace, a clue that reignited the search for answers and sparked a series of investigations and new discoveries, leading the case in an unexpected direction. The discovery of a backpack belonging to one of the climbers was extraordinary in itself, but what truly shocked everyone was the contents found inside. Inside the backpack, investigators discovered a camera, its lenses covered in snow but still functional. The idea that the film inside the camera might reveal something new was exciting. This wasn't just a chance to find tangible evidence of what had really happened in those unexplored mountains. It also provided a unique opportunity to revisit the entire theory behind the disappearance of the two climbers. When the film from the camera was finally developed, what the investigators found wasn't exactly what they expected, but something that put everything into a new perspective. The images, although not fully clarifying what had happened to Mallory and Irvine, showed that they had come much closer to the summit than previously thought. There was one particularly intriguing photo showing Mallory and Irvine near an elevated area, with a landscape that could be interpreted as the view from the top of Everest. This was enough to renew the hypothesis that, yes, Mallory and Irvine had reached the summit, but the question remained: why, then, did they disappear without a trace? This breakthrough marked a significant turning point in the investigation, as until then, many had believed the climbers had failed in their attempt to reach the summit and were tragically defeated by the relentless forces of Everest. The discovery of the images revealed that there was more to this story than anyone had imagined. Not only had the mountain been more unforgiving than anyone could have imagined, but the possibility that Mallory and Irvine had indeed achieved the greatest feat in mountaineering at the time opened up a whole new series of questions. How could two men who were so close to the top of the world have mysteriously disappeared? The answer, as it would soon be realized, wasn't simple. the revelation of the camera brought to light new lines of investigation. The first concerned the extreme physical and psychological conditions the climbers faced during the ascent. Everest is a merciless mountain, with unpredictable weather and extreme altitude conditions. The thin air at higher altitudes drastically reduces the amount of oxygen, which can lead to disorientation, extreme fatigue, and even physical collapse. Many climbers who attempted to scale Everest in the decades that followed reported blurry vision, dizziness, and the inability to make clear decisions as they neared the summit. In the case of Mallory and Irvine, these conditions might have been even more severe, considering the lack of proper equipment and the additional challenges they faced in 1924. The possibility that physical exhaustion, combined with disorientation, contributed to their disappearance became an increasingly plausible theory. But the weather, as fierce as the mountain itself, also played a crucial role in the investigation. Sudden storms, cutting winds, and freezing temperatures are common features of Everest. And if Mallory and Irvine reached the top, it's possible that the weather caught them in a catastrophic way. Historically, other expeditions have faced storms so severe that even with the best equipment, climbers were forced to turn back or seek shelter before reaching the summit. And as if that weren't enough, Everest has a cruel history of people who reach the top, only to succumb on the descent due to exhaustion or lack of oxygen. In this context, the idea that Mallory and Irvine might have been victims of the relentless weather or a violent storm that caught them while trying to descend made perfect sense. It was possible they had reached the summit, but Everest, instead of defeating them during the ascent, had defeated them in an even crueler way afterward. However, the discovery of the camera and the subsequent advancement in the investigation weren't limited to the physical and climatic conditions of the mountain. New information also emerged from subsequent expeditions, with other climbers reporting tracks and traces that could possibly have belonged to Mallory and Irvine. Reports from past expeditions suggested that there were signs of their presence at higher altitudes on Everest, locations where no one had thought to look. These reports led investigators to expand their search beyond physical and photographic evidence, beginning to consider the testimonies and observations of those who had tried to conquer the mountain in the years that followed. Surprisingly, many of these reports aligned with the possibility that Mallory and Irvine had survived longer than previously thought, perhaps even for days, after reaching the top of the world. This changed the way historians and mountaineers viewed the case, adding a layer of complexity that had previously seemed unthinkable. Additionally, new theories began to emerge, not just about the physical and environmental conditions, but also about the psychology of the climbers. Mallory and Irvine were undoubtedly two determined men, but they were also under immense psychological pressure. The mental and emotional exhaustion they must have felt as they approached the summit, facing not only the elements but also the idea of achieving the impossible, could have affected their clarity of judgment. The descent would have been the crucial moment, as the mountain, with all its grandeur, could still have taken away any chance of survival, even for the most experienced. As the investigation deepened, a new generation of mountaineers and historians began to revisit everything we knew about Mallory and Irvine's expedition. Experts began questioning the initial analyses of the expedition and exploring the possibility that Everest was more treacherous than anyone had imagined. Many started to believe that Mallory and Irvine had, in fact, reached the summit, but, faced with the adversities of the weather, terrain, and disorientation, they couldn't make it back. Others, however, suggested that the failure could have been more personal, related to the fact that the two men were completely alone at the top of the world, with no communication and no help. Meanwhile, the families of Mallory and Irvine began to feel a mix of relief and renewed pain. The search for answers was more alive than ever, but the emotional cost of reliving so much pain after so many years was hard to bear. Ruth Mallory, George Mallory's wife, who had waited for decades, finally found herself facing a new glimmer of hope. An answer, albeit partial. But the answer also brought a new series of questions, and, as always, Everest remained the final guardian of its greatest mysteries. What really happened to Mallory and Irvine? The clues were piling up, but the real answer still felt distant, like a mirage on the horizon of the mountain. As the investigation into the disappearance of George Mallory and Andrew Irvine advanced, new encounters emerged with key figures who had been directly involved in subsequent expeditions to Everest. What initially seemed like a simple search for answers became a complex web of contradictory accounts, questionable evidence, and, for many, a constant sense of distrust regarding the official versions of events. Everest, which had always been a symbol of bravery and conquest, was now beginning to be seen by some as a place where, for over half a century, the true stories had been suppressed or distorted. Those who survived expeditions to Everest in the decades following 1924 were now being called upon to share their own experiences and impressions, often offering perspectives that raised more doubts than provided answers. In 1980, a crucial reunion took place with a member of one of the expeditions closest to Mallory and Irvine's, a veteran mountaineer named Edward Jones. Jones had been part of the 1933 British expedition and, with a sharp memory of the Everest mountains, had become an important figure in trying to understand what had happened to the two climbers. During an interview with investigators, Jones revealed that in 1933, he himself had found traces and signs of a possible passage by Mallory and Irvine in an area of the mountain that many considered impossible to reach. Jones described in detail the feeling of something being there at high altitudes, as if the traces of Mallory and Irvine were closer than anyone thought. However, he was straightforward in saying that, at the time, he was discouraged from going further by his superiors, who were more focused on other parts of the ascent. He admitted he knew there was something there, but the mission was more about the progress of his own expedition than solving an old mystery. This statement had an immediate impact. Jones not only suggested that there were possible traces of Mallory and Irvine, but also implied that subsequent expeditions to 1924 might have been deliberately diverted from areas that could have revealed more about the disappearance. Investigators began to wonder, was it possible that the records of the 1933 expedition, and perhaps other expeditions, had been manipulated to conceal crucial information? The idea that vital evidence might have been neglected or even covered up brought a new layer of distrust, something that had seemed unthinkable before. Could it be that the British government itself, in an effort to protect the nation's prestige, had avoided a more rigorous search for Mallory and Irvine, fearing that an embarrassing revelation about the failure of such an important expedition would be a blow to public morale? These questions began to dominate conversations within mountaineering circles and encounters with survivors from later expeditions. In 1985, mountaineer John Roberts, who had participated in the 1961 expedition, also shared his suspicions. He stated, with some frustration, that during his own attempt to scale Everest, he and his team were warned by local guides about a mysterious site at higher altitudes. According to Roberts, the guides said the location seemed to have a dark energy, as if it were the tomb of something or someone. What drew the most attention was his claim that during several subsequent expeditions, he felt that Everest didn't want to be climbed. The idea that the mountain held something much deeper than just a physical ascent began to take shape, and with it came suspicions that Everest's very nature, with its extreme and unpredictable conditions, might be even more unforgiving than imagined. Roberts questioned why so many expeditions didn't search for Mallory and Irvine in more remote areas, and instead focused their search on more popular routes. He suggested that, at some point, The possibility that both climbers had survived longer than originally thought was being systematically ignored, possibly due to political or prestige reasons. But while some of these observations offered a darker view of past expeditions, other revelations came from survivors of more recent expeditions who expressed deep skepticism regarding the veracity of early expedition reports. For example, mountaineer Eric Watson, who participated in the 1973 Everest climb, shared an intriguing story. During their descent from the summit, Watson and his team passed through an area where wind and snow had left a uniform blanket over the terrain. While resting, Watson claimed that he and his companions saw something very strange. A footprint, almost perfectly preserved in the snow. The footprint appeared human, but Watson was surprised to realize it was very old, of a type of boot that didn't match the style of the 1970s. It was a mountaineering boot from the 1920s, and for Watson, this meant one thing. Someone, or perhaps two, had passed through that spot long before they did. This sparked a new kind of speculation. Could this be confirmation that Mallory and Irvine had gotten this far? And maybe, after more than 50 years, their journey was still being recorded in small fragments by those following the same route? These accounts, coming from different generations of climbers, began to shape a more complex and nuanced narrative. Suspicions grew, and more doubts were raised. The big question was, who was telling the truth, and who was hiding it? The contradictions between earlier expeditions and more recent ones revealed a troubling truth, that the answers about Mallory and Irvine could be much harder to reach than anyone had imagined. And with that came suspicions about the investigators themselves. Some began to wonder if the search for answers had become more about fame and prestige than the real discovery of the facts. Even mountaineer John Roberts, in his statements, suggested that subsequent Everest expeditions might have been motivated by personal interests more than by the true search for the truth about Mallory and Irvine. These interrogations not only hindered the progress of the investigation, but also created a battlefield of ideas in the mountaineering world. Some believe that the popular theories about Mallory and Irvine's summit could have been built on ego and the desire to create a heroic narrative, while others, more skeptical, saw the reports from later expeditions as ways to correct what many considered a historical mistake: the failure to identify Mallory and Irvine's true trajectory. The truths that emerged from interviews and reunions with witnesses from expeditions only made the case even more entangled, where the search for answers seemed to move away from a single logical explanation and became a fertile ground for contradictions and conflicts of interest. As these discoveries multiplied, one thing began to become clear. The truth about Mallory and Irvine's disappearance wasn't just about finding clues on the mountain or understanding the traces left by their boots in the snow. The truth was, in every untold story, in every investigation that was circumvented or ignored, and in every climber who, in searching for answers, was also searching for something deeper within themselves. As the investigations into the disappearance of George Mallory and Andrew Irvine progressed, revelations began to emerge that, for over half a century, had remained buried under layers of ice and speculation. With each new discovery, the mystery deepened, and with it, the urgency for answers grew. Everest, with its grandeur, seemed to have kept its secrets all this time, but the traces left by Mallory and Irvine were now being uncovered, revealing not only the climber's path, but also the conflicts and ethical dilemmas that arose around the case. The truth, as it got closer, not only challenged the expectations of the investigators, but also exposed human nature in its rawest form. One of the most surprising discoveries came when a team of mountaineers revisiting Everest's higher regions found Mallory's body, or rather what remained of him. The body, frozen and preserved by the mountain's relentless cold, offered new clues about Mallory and Irvine's final journey. With the body came confirmation that Mallory at least had reached impressive heights. His body was found in a location that didn't correspond to the most common climbing routes, but seemed more aligned with the theory that he and Irvine had come very close to the summit. Experts, analyzing the position of the body and the conditions it was found in, suggested that Mallory might have still been alive when he fell, in a moment of despair, possibly after reaching the top. But what stood out most was the fact that, beside Mallory's body, there were no signs of Irvine. This discovery, while significant, raised more questions than answers. Mallory's body was partially preserved, but there was nothing definitive to confirm that he had indeed reached the summit. Furthermore, the absence of Irvine raised a series of speculations and theories that quickly began to circulate. Where was Irvine? If Mallory had fallen in that spot, had Irvine fallen with him? Or had he survived longer, only to succumb later? The idea that Mallory and Irvine might have separated at some point during their ascent was now being considered, though many climbers doubted this possibility, given the extreme conditions of the mountain. At this point, the tension between the investigators and key figures from the expeditions began to reach its peak. With every new revelation, the search for truth became more complex. The prevailing theory about Mallory and Irvine's disappearance up until then held that the two climbers had been victims of Everest, casualties of the mountain's relentless nature. But with Mallory's body found, many began to question whether this explanation was sufficient. Some believed that Everest wasn't in fact the main enemy of the climbers, but something far more intriguing and profound: humanity. The central figure in this new clash between the investigators was James Harrington, a historian of expeditions and mountaineering expert who had spent years studying the deaths of Mallory and Irvine. He was convinced that, after the latest discoveries, a darker explanation needed to be considered. For Harrington, the lack of clear evidence regarding the summit didn't indicate failure, but rather a cover-up. He suggested that Mallory and Irvine, upon reaching the summit, had discovered something that, for personal and perhaps political reasons, should have been kept secret. The climbers might have been forced into a hasty retreat, or something more insidious might have occurred that led to Irvine's disappearance. Perhaps something related to human error or an attempt to conceal the truth about their achievement. Harrington began to raise suspicions that Mallory might have reached the summit. But the real story wasn't the one everyone knew. The two climbers, according to him, might have encountered something that led to an unexpected fight for survival. And perhaps, in a moment of panic, one of them made a fatal decision. Or, even more disturbingly, perhaps something or someone else was involved. While this theory was met with skepticism by many of his colleagues, it was pivotal in shaking up the investigation. The idea that nature and Everest itself weren't the only culprits seemed to bring out the darkest and most human truth of the story. An element of sabotage or human error, perhaps even abandonment, hung in the air. The battle for the truth about Mallory and Irvine intensified, not only between the experts, but also among the expedition members and the climbers' families. Ruth Mallory, George's wife, who had never stopped believing her husband had reached the summit, now found herself confronted with an uncomfortable truth. She questioned the integrity of everyone involved and wondered if, at some point, those responsible for retrieving Mallory's body had overlooked crucial evidence, trying to protect the name of Everest and the history of mountaineering itself. Ruth could not accept that her husband, a hero to her, had fallen victim to a human failure that had been conveniently covered up by all involved. She became a powerful voice in the movement seeking the full truth, without cuts or omissions. The investigations continued to deepen, with more interviews and confrontations between the experts and survivors of later expeditions. Each new testimony seemed to align more with the idea that, yes, Mallory and Irvine had reached the summit, but something had caused them to disappear right after their achievement. The theory that they may have faced a desperate fight for survival immediately after reaching Everest's glory became an increasingly popular concept. But as the pieces of the puzzle were put together, even more questions emerged. In the end, the mystery of Mallory and Irvine, a story of courage, tragedy, and overcoming, became more complex than anyone could have imagined. Each revelation, each new piece of information, not only offered clues about the climber's fate, but also brought to light the human and political secrets that had been hidden in the ice and snow of Everest for over 50 years. The suspicions of sabotage, human failure, and the fight for survival became essential parts of this story, and the search for the truth, more than just about finding out what happened, turned into an attempt to understand the limits of human courage and the impact of error, lies, and omission. Everest, which had been the stage for so many struggles and conquests, didn't seem to want to release its truth so easily. But with every step, the world was getting closer to the conclusion of this epic and dramatic story. And deep down, the greatest revelation of all might have been that the biggest mystery of all wasn't the fate of Mallory and Irvine, but what those climbers truly faced during that final ascent, where everything, even history, was at stake. The final expedition to Everest was about to start. After decades of theories, speculation, and investigations, the opportunity to finally answer the question that had haunted the world of mountaineering was finally at hand. In 1999, a new team of experts was assembled, consisting of historians, mountaineers, and scientists, all with a single goal: to uncover the truth, not only about the disappearance of George Mallory and Andrew Irvine, but also about what really happened that fateful summer of 1924. Everest, with all its majesty, seemed ready to reveal its deepest secrets. The expedition was underway, but there was something more. The mission was no longer just about climbing the mountain, but about discovering what the two climbers had faced, whether they had truly reached the summit, and if so, what had led to their untimely deaths. The team was equipped with the most advanced mountaineering technology and scanning equipment, far more sophisticated than what had been available in previous expeditions. High-tech drones were used to map remote areas of Everest, where Mallory and Irvine might have gotten lost. Satellites, thermal cameras, and other devices that allowed for a more precise search than ever were now at the disposal of the investigators. The tension was palpable. There wasn't just the hope of finding physical evidence. There was also the emotional weight of decades of uncertainty, of families who had lost loved ones, of experts who were on the brink of solving one of the greatest enigmas in mountaineering history. But at the same time, there was the fear that Everest, as always, would keep its greatest secret until the very end. As the team ascended the mountain, challenges began to arise quickly. The conditions on Everest, relentless as always, tested their limits. The thin air, freezing temperatures, and sudden storms made every step a fight for survival. As the expedition moved higher into the altitudes, the terrain became even more treacherous, with ice crevasses and areas where winds cut with violent force. The tension mounted with every meter they climbed. It wasn't just about finding out what had happened to Mallory and Irvine. It was about facing Everest, an enemy that had defeated so many before them. The mystery was alive more than ever, and the weight of discovering the truth seemed to make Everest even more dangerous. But it was when the team reached a remote area, just a few meters from the summit, that the first big discovery was made. On a virtually inaccessible ice ridge, the expedition leader, mountaineer Richard Palmer, spotted something that seemed impossible. A fragment of clothing, almost completely worn away by time, was found caught on the rocks. The color of the clothing had almost faded, but the features were unmistakable. It was part of an alpinist's uniform from the 1920s. Palmer and his team, hearts racing, began to explore the surrounding area. The intense cold made the work difficult, but they couldn't give up now. Everest seemed finally to be giving in. After hours of meticulous searching, Palmer, accompanied by an archaeology expert, found another crucial piece: a length of rope tied to a rock, which appeared to have been cut abruptly. The fragment was in poor condition, but upon closer examination, they realized it was very similar to the kind of rope used by climbers in the 1924 expedition. What struck the team the most was the fact that the rope seemed to have been cut precisely, which indicated that someone, with a determined purpose, had been trying to descend quickly. The hypothesis that Mallory and Irvine had indeed reached the summit before suffering an even more dramatic tragedy was reinforced by these discoveries. Something had happened at the summit, something that had made the descent impossible for the two climbers. However, as the team made these discoveries, a new snowstorm was rapidly approaching, forcing them to act even faster. The tension increased. The mountain, which seemed to be finally revealing its answers, was also showing its most unforgiving side. The storm, intensifying with every minute, forced the expedition to return to base before the risk became deadly. But before heading back, the team was able to capture images that showed more details of the area where the clothing fragments and the rope had been found, with drones allowing for a more detailed analysis of the region. With these new images and information, the team returned to the base camp, where the experts began to analyze everything they had found. Over the next few days, the discoveries were further examined. The general impression was that Mallory and Irvine had indeed reached the summit, but at a high cost. Everest, with its uncontrollable force, had probably defeated them shortly after their achievement. The reasoning was clear. After the historic ascent, perhaps the two climbers had been forced to fight for survival, with freezing temperatures and strong winds, which might have led to a fatal failure. But the true discovery was that, in the end, it wasn't the mountain that killed them. It was the fight for survival, human errors, extreme physical wear, and perhaps the need to do the impossible in a world unprepared for such audacity. At the base of the expedition, Leader Palmer gathered his team and the other members of the expedition to discuss the findings. It was impossible not to feel the emotion in the air. What had happened on Everest in 1924 was now clearer, but it still wasn't a complete answer. The search for answers had yielded results, but Everest wasn't ready to give everything all at once. As everyone prepared to move on to the final stage of the journey, the team received one last surprise. The photographic records of Mallory and Irvine, which had been found in 1979, were finally examined and showed additional details that reinforced the theory that both climbers had indeed reached the summit. But the cost of that achievement was deadly. But the true revelation was still to come. When the final analysis was made, it became clear that Mallory and Irvine had been more than just adventurers. They had been pioneers, the first to attempt something that seemed impossible, risking their lives in a journey that defied logic and human nature itself. They not only conquered Everest, but in a way, they conquered it in a manner no one could have predicted. The expedition returned to the world with more answers, but also with new questions. Mallory and Irvine, in reality, weren't just victims of an epic failure. They were heroes who, in their quest for glory, had pushed the limits of the impossible, and in their sacrifice, left an indelible legacy. Everest, as always, remained the greatest of all mysteries, but now, somehow, it had been challenged and conquered. And yet, the mountain, with its cold, distant silence, still held its final answers for those brave enough to continue the journey. The final expedition, which trekked across Everest with the goal of uncovering the truth about the disappearance of George Mallory and Andrew Irvine, not only brought answers, but also a profound emotional weight. After years of uncertainty, theories, and speculation, the team was finally able to piece together the puzzle and, in doing so, provide an answer that, at once, offered relief and added a new layer of mystery about what really happened during that 1924 journey. Upon returning home, the investigation team, now with their discoveries clearer, knew that the revelation of what happened to Mallory and Irvine would forever change the history of mountaineering. Mallory's body had been found, and with it, a series of clues that confirmed he and Irvine had indeed reached the summit of Everest. It was no longer speculation or a romantic theory about their achievement, but a scientific conclusion, backed by physical and photographic evidence. Justice for Mallory and Irvine was finally served, as what had long been a mystery was, in a way, a confirmed feat. They had indeed conquered Everest, and more importantly, they had made history, even though the price of their victory had been their lives. But the truth, while liberating in many ways, also brought with it an emotional burden that was hard to carry. For the descendants of Mallory and Irvine, especially the families who had lived with the doubt and suffering for so many years, the revelation brought a mix of relief and sorrow. Ruth Mallory, George's wife, who had steadfastly believed for decades that her husband had indeed reached the summit, could now finally rest, knowing her intuition had been right. But at the same time, the pain of knowing her husband paid the price for his courage, disappearing so close to glory, didn't fade. The void left by his absence, which had lingered for more than 70 years, seemed to have finally found an answer. But this answer was far from a celebration of victory. It was the bitter realization that, in the end, the greatest sacrifice of the climbers wasn't the attempt to reach the top, but the loss of their lives without the recognition they deserved. Justice, for many, was finally served. The conquest of Everest by Mallory and Irvine, once discredited by so many, was now an indisputable fact. The story of the two climbers, which had once seemed like an unsolved tragedy, could now be revisited with a new, deeper, and more respectful perspective. They were no longer just adventurers who died in failure. They were heroes who defied the impossible and conquered a mountain that, until then, seemed insurmountable. Their story was finally rewritten, and with that, the legacy of Mallory and Irvine came to be recognized as one of the greatest achievements in mountaineering history. But true justice wasn't just about revealing the conquest. For the survivors, for those still alive who had lost friends, husbands, or sons on that journey, justice came in the form of a recognition that went beyond simply reaching the summit. It was the acknowledgement that Mallory and Irvine, though lost to history for so long, had in fact made history in a way far greater than anyone could have imagined. The search for answers wasn't just about finding the remains of a mountaineer or photos from an expedition. It was a quest to honor the courage and spirit of adventure those men had exemplified, and which over time had been overshadowed by the pain of their premature loss. However, while justice was served for Mallory and Irvine, the truth also brought to light unresolved issues that now seemed even more evident. The experts, analyzing the discoveries, began to raise questions about the decisions made during subsequent expeditions. Why had the expeditions that followed in 1933 and the decades after not made a deeper search in the more remote areas of Everest? Why, over so many years, had the clear evidence that Mallory and Irvine had reached the summit not been adequately analyzed? There were failures, misjudgments, and perhaps even negligence, which kept the Everest mystery unsolved for more than 75 years. The justice done for Mallory and Irvine also brought to light institutional and human failures that took so long to correct. Members of the subsequent expeditions were now called to answer for their choices and the way they handled the search for evidence. The critique extended beyond the mountain. It pointed to a system that hadn't properly dealt with the stories and legacies of expeditions. The families of Mallory and Irvine also had to grapple with the complexities of the newly discovered truth. For Ruth Mallory, knowing that her husband had reached the summit was a relief, but at the same time, it brought renewed pain, for she knew that, upon returning from the mountain, George would never come home again. For Mallory's daughter, who had grown up without her father, the answers brought a mix of pride and sadness. She felt that, in some way, Everest had become part of her own identity, but at the same time she knew that piece of history, though now resolved, would not bring her father back. The search for answers about what happened to Mallory and Irvine couldn't erase a lifetime of mourning without their presence. For Irvine's descendants, the same feeling of loss permeated their lives, but there was also a renewed sense of justice. The discovery finally brought recognition of Andrew Irvine's courage, whose memory had often been overshadowed by Mallory's figure. Though Irvine hadn't survived to witness the impact of his journey, his name was now, indeed, recorded in history, alongside Mallory, as one of the pioneers who dared to challenge the mountain. With the final discovery, the mystery was indeed solved, but the search for answers and reflection on the choices made over time continued to resonate. Mallory and Irvine were no longer just symbols of tragedy, but heroes whose sacrifices and achievements were now being properly recognized. Everest, which had always been seen as a symbol of conquest, was now also remembered as the stage of an enigma that took decades to unravel, but which, when finally revealed, shed light on human nature, courage, and the failures of the system of exploration and memory. Everest, now with its secret revealed, seemed in some way more welcoming, but still retained its aura of mystery. The final answer didn't only bring the satisfaction of truth, but also a reflection on the cost of knowledge, exploration, and honor. The story of Mallory and Irvine would continue to inspire generations, but more than that, it would remind everyone that sometimes humanity's greatest achievements come with the greatest sacrifices. As the final revelations about the fate of George Mallory and Andrew Irvine were made, a sense of closure began to settle in. However, this closure didn't bring the lightness that many expected, but a deep weight, a mix of relief, sadness, and a new understanding of what truly happened on the unforgiving heights of Everest. The story of the two climbers had finally been revealed, but the consequences of their journey, the emotional cost, and the impact of this truth were something everyone would have to contend with. Ruth Mallory, George's wife, was one of the first to reflect on the new discoveries. During all the years of waiting, she had found herself trapped in a maze of doubts and conflicting emotions. There was the burning desire to know the truth, to be certain that her husband had reached the summit. Now, with the confirmation that Mallory and Irvine had indeed conquered the top, part of her pain was softened. But this truth also brought to the surface another pain, perhaps harder to bear, the fact that George would never come home. The relief of finally knowing what had happened was tempered by the reality that the man she loved was not there to see the victory he had dreamed of. She felt more than ever the weight of the loss, not only because of George's premature death, but also because, in many ways, he had been a hero without recognition for so long. Everest had taken his life, but it had also hidden his glory. She thought about how the world, until that moment, had not truly recognized the sacrifice George had made, until finally the truth was brought to light, and Mallory and Irvine could be remembered as they deserved, not just as tragic figures, but as pioneers, trailblazers of a mountain that challenged everyone. For Mallory's daughter, who grew up without a father, the discoveries meant a sort of reconciliation with the past. Although she had never known George, the stories and legends of his courage had always been a distant and vague legacy until now. She could finally understand the magnitude of her father's achievement. The confirmation that he had reached the summit was both an accomplishment and a loss. In her mind, the stories she had heard throughout her life about the man who mysteriously disappeared were finally filled with meaning. She not only felt proud of the feat, but also experienced a sense of sadness, knowing that Everest had taken what could never be returned. The connection to her father, which for so long had been just an abstract idea, now became a more tangible reality, but also a more painful one. But the reflection wasn't limited to the families of Mallory and Irvine. The mountaineering community and the experts involved in the investigation began to evaluate the implications of this discovery for the world of mountaineering and expeditions. Everest, which had always represented the ultimate test of human endurance, now became a place of great learning, but also of profound lament. The sacrifice of Mallory and Irvine, and the mystery that surrounded them, had transformed into an eternal symbol of courage, but also of human error. After all, the misjudgments made in subsequent expeditions, the failures in communication, and the disregard for searching more deeply for answers had prolonged the suffering and fed a mystery that shouldn't have been kept for so long. The mountain, with its imposing and relentless nature, continued to guard its secrets. But now mountaineers and future generations who climbed Everest would do so with renewed respect. Mallory and Irvine, whose names had once been relegated to obscurity, now became icons of modern mountaineering, remembered not only for their courage and determination, but also for the lessons their story left behind. Their sacrifice, once ignored and neglected, was now a legacy of honor, even though it came with the weight of pain. The experts involved in the investigation began to reflect on what had truly motivated Mallory and Irvine's ascent. Were they trying, like so many others, to achieve the impossible? Or was there something else at stake? The answers would never be clear, but their journey was a testament to what happens when the human spirit refuses to be limited. Everest, in its grandeur, didn't just test their bodies and minds, but also challenged their convictions and the concept of what is possible. The true achievement of Mallory and Irvine wasn't in the summit, but in the fact that for a brief moment, they lived beyond human limitations and reached something that few, if any, had ever achieved. In Ruth Mallory's life, the discovery represented both relief and renewed pain. She reflected on the sacrifice of her husband and the legacy he and Irvine left behind. The pain of the loss would never be erased, but now the truth made the pain more understandable, more tangible. Ruth knew, like no one else, that Everest, in its cruelty, would never return what was lost. But in a way, she felt that George's spirit was still alive, stronger than ever, in every step taken by those who, like him, sought to defy the impossible. In the end, the story of Mallory and Irvine became an eternal reminder that human courage, though it has its limits, is capable of achieving extraordinary feats, often without immediate recognition, but with a lasting impact that spans time. Everest, now more than a mountain of fog and mystery, was also a monument to perseverance, to the spirit of adventure, and to the memory of those who dared to reach the impossible.